In my home country, North Macedonia, the word European is everywhere. So I always find the question, do you identify as a European, difficult to answer. Sports commentators in North Macedonia and the Balkans more broadly, even though most countries in the region are not members of the European Union, but are definitely European, geographically speaking, and historically as well. Most sports commentators, when they want to compliment a goal that has just been scored in a soccer game, for example, they would say, "Oh my God, that was a Euro goal." In English, it doesn't make much sense. It does make sense in some other West European languages. I know for a fact that it's used in Italian in the exact same context. But I nonetheless find it very interesting because it indicates that European in the Balkans is dissociated from its geographical features and has simply become a mark, a symbol of quality and superiority. So politicians also use it a lot in their campaigns when they talk about voting for a European future. If you vote for us, we'll make a European future happen for our country, and not only in the sense of becoming a member of the European Union, but simply living the good life more broadly. So European is not a fixed characteristic, I guess, is what my main message is. Because you can't be European all the time. European needs work. You can be less European on some days and with some specific actions, and more European with more positive behavior at other times. There are un-European actions as well, if you're not acting European enough, both at the individual and at the collective level as a country. So I do define, to answer the question finally, I do define as European, and I do identify that way, but I'm actively trying to be the most European version of my European self. Without a doubt, came in 2015, when the European Union mediated over my home country's political crisis. Then Macedonia, now North Macedonia. There was a major wiretapping scandal in my country which revealed major abuses of power by the then government, and the European Union stepped in to facilitate the negotiations between the ruling party at the time and the opposition in order for the country to be able to hold transparent elections. The EU did this in an impartial way, but nonetheless in a very assertive way in defense of its own values, the European values. And to me, this really demonstrated how massive of an impact the EU can make when there is a political will to do so in a candidate member country such as Macedonia. And of course, this was only possible because North Macedonia has a very strongly Europhilic, pro-EU population, and the EU say simply held a lot of sway over Macedonian voters, and the ruling party, despite its self-interest in maintaining power, agreed to the EU's mediating role and the eventual democratic, peaceful resolution of this crisis. It's controversial probably to cite something other than Brexit as the worst European moment in recent history, but I think the inability of the EU to enforce Article 7 against Hungary, Poland, and other democratic backsliders in the Union is a worse moment because it is structural, as opposed to Brexit simply being the decision of one member state to leave the Union, which was always, structurally speaking, a possibility and will still be a possibility in the Union. Whereas the situation with Article 7 is a reflection of the increasingly state-like and state-based, state-dominated character of the EU. So the worst nightmare of realist scholars in international relations has been proven to be true, and is still being proven to be true with the persistence of the veto power and all its negative ramifications, not only in the area of rule of law and therefore undermining the EU's core values, of course, but also in areas such as enlargement, for example, where France and Bulgaria have recently used their veto power in a non-European way, I would argue, without any basis, to block the opening of accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. So the veto power, which is of course a structural issue and seems to be defended by the majority of if not all, actually, EU member states, because they all need it and use it for different purposes at different points in time. It seems to be, to me, the most important obstacle to the full practical application of the European idea at this point in time. It might seem less relevant and less monumental compared to other EU milestones over the years, but what I would define as an existential moment for the EU was simply the decision to enlarge after the end of the Cold War. Of course, the EU was a different institution at the time, even by a different name, of course. And some people would argue that it was always part of European values to make Europe, free and whole. So therefore, of course, enlargement was going to happen. It was never in dispute. But in fact, it was, of course, as always, a matter of political will. And the fact that there was political will in Europe at the time for enlargement into Eastern Europe was a demonstration of the power of the European idea. And of course, when I talk about enlargement, I'm mainly referring to the 2004 enlargement into 10 mainly East European, but not only countries. Also Bulgaria and Romania 3 years later, and Croatia in 2013. Perhaps also, hopefully, some other East European countries in the future. Now, of course, in hindsight, the timing of the 2004 enlargement might seem premature, with all the backsliding in Hungary and Poland especially, and of course, now we wonder whether a more careful and more conditional enlargement process for these countries might have prevented that backsliding. And those are lessons to be taken in mind for future reference, but the enlargement itself, regardless of its possibly premature timing and imperfect execution, will always remain an existential component of the European idea. My favorite thing about the European Union is how all-encompassing it is, and therefore it is often the little things that make the EU so important in our lives. So I will mention a very seemingly trivial example. Many people don't know that the fact that phone chargers are the same throughout the continent, or at least throughout most of the continent, is because of the EU and a regulation that goes back to 2009, which encourages, even though it doesn't mandate, that all countries that are member states use the same power voltage, which has resulted in people being able to use their own charger from their own country when they travel throughout the Union. So now when I except for the UK, obviously, with the notable exception of the United Kingdom, but now every time I go to another European country and I have forgotten my charger, I don't have to panic because I can always borrow a charger from someone else, which will still work perfectly fine on my cell phone. It's the little things. Follow from the rest of my interview, and they are definitely in order of importance. So the first one and most important one is to abolish the veto right, if possible, in all areas of voting, because it simply, by its very nature, it undermines the core European ideals, so it should be abolished altogether. But given the lack of political will to do so, abolishing it in some particularly problematic areas such as budget, adoption, rule of law, punishment, and enlargement should probably be the priority. And then the second most important point on the agenda should be to make progress towards completing enlargement. It doesn't have to happen immediately. It probably shouldn't happen immediately because it might not be in the interest of the acceding countries themselves to join the Union before facing a more severe conditionality that would help them democratize before accession. But the fact remains that 30% of European countries, countries that geographically belong on this continent, are still outside of the Union, and the idea of a Europe whole and free will never fully materialize until they become members. And then finally, it would be responsible, obviously, to talk about future EU priorities without mentioning anything related to the environment. So I would say that net zero emissions, or at least the journey towards net zero emissions as a final objective, should be at least the third biggest priority of the EU.